name of the living God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer.
Amen.
There is a famous phrase from a former British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson, who said, "A week is a long time in politics." A week is a long time in politics. And the underlying message of this Palm Sunday is to be cautious and not to pay too much attention to the adulation of the crowds, because in less than a week they're hailing you as the King, the Messiah, and they're spitting at you as you're carrying your cross. And the crowd can be fickle. And that phrase, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, that we were singing, is foretold in the prophet Zechariah. The king would not come riding through the gates of Jerusalem in a war chariot, but on a mule. And we read about this in 1 Kings. So the priest Zadok and the prophet Nathan and Benaniah son of Jehoiada and the Cherethites and the Pelethites went down and had Solomon ride on King David's mule and led him to Gihon. And this was for his coronation. So this was a presidential cortege riding down Connecticut Avenue with all the crowds hailing the new leader. But there were only two problems. There was already a king on the throne in Jerusalem, and there was also above him a Caesar, an imperial emperor ruling in Rome. And I wonder what those authorities must have thought about as Jesus carried out this dramatic entry. They may have thought it was a quaint cultural reenaction of some historic moment in the past. But with armed Roman soldiers at every corner, suspicious that Jewish nationalist insurgents might stage some act of retaliation or attack at Rome, they must have been concerned. And it's only when Jesus enters the temple that we see things begin to fall apart. And he overturns the tables of the money changers. And what their job was basically was to take the polluted secular money of Rome that had on it the emperor's head and to exchange it for temple coinage so that people could buy animals to sacrifice. And it's interesting that at the trial of Jesus, the reason why he is condemned to death is that he is a threat both to our nation and to our religion, to our temple. He's a threat to their business and to their sense of being Jewish. He's accused of blasphemy, claiming to be a god, something that would have offended both the Jews and the Romans, who saw the emperor as God. And so as the week progressed, the authorities watched the crowd being whipped up into a frenzy by this earlier cultural pageant that we celebrate right now, into a potential rebellion and a threat. And when they finally arrest Jesus, they come with weapons because they fear an armed revolt. But Jesus says to Peter, "Put away your sword." And it's interesting that part of the dramatic reading that we're about to have, there was a man called Barabbas, who was one of these national terrorists. And the crowd in the end want Barabbas released as a sop to this Jewish nationalist passion by Rome. So the crowd is not only fickle, but it can be easily manipulated by all of these forces that are at work during this Holy Week, as we look darkly into a story about the worst and the best of what it means to be human. And I want you to notice the detail in the story. We've already got a glimpse of it when Brian read from Mark. There is detail. Jesus prepares. He's already told people that he will be sending people to pick out this mule. He's prepared the upper room where he will celebrate the Passover, but he will take that ancient story of the liberation of Egypt into the promised land, and he will change it slightly. And he'll take the cup of wine with the bitter herbs, and he'll say, it is my blood, it is my sacrifice that is going to be shed for you, for the remission of sins for all people. No more temple sacrifice is needed. And this body, this bread that is shared at the Passover feast, that this is my body that is shared and broken for you. It was audacious. What Jesus was saying was audacious. And the crowd wanted a warrior Messiah king who would light the fuse to finally rid their country of the hated Romans and return Israel to its theocratic roots. He tells Peter to put away his sword, and clearly he is not what people expect him to be. It is the kingdom of justice and peace, but it's going to be brought in through nonviolence. And he tells Peter to put away his sword. It's that self-emptying, that wonderful reading that Cam read this morning, the self-emptying of Jesus, who becomes the servant, who risks his reputation and his own physical safety to become an example of how Christians should be servant leaders, bringing in God's reign of justice through self-sacrificial, nonviolent love. And in a few moments, we will be reading more of the details of that story. And there are deep moments of connection and intimacy. The desertion, the betrayal by his inner circle. And the character of Judas is an interesting character. And in many ways, I think he's been given a bad rap by the church. Because if the expectation of the crowd and even the disciples that Jesus was the one who was going to liberate them from oppression, there is a school of thought that says Judas actually thought that he was doing Jesus a favor by signaling this moment of revolt. And why did he kill himself? So that he's often portrayed as either possessed by Satan, or he did this for power, or he did this for money. But we know in the Gospels that the disciples have conversations among themselves. When Jesus becomes the king, which cabinet positions will we have? So Judas is seen in a different light, and he is in some ways the patron saint of bad judgment. He backed the wrong horse. He didn't do all of his homework. And we can connect with that. The trial, the stripping, the humiliation, the violence, the pure unjustified violence that Jesus takes onto himself is in this story. And he enters the criminal world of prisoners and thieves. And he becomes just another writhing piece of flesh who reminds the onlooking masses that if you step out of line, this will happen to you. And crucifixion is a particularly vile instrument used by Romans to control the population. It was reserved for the worst offenders who were made a public example of. And many Roman cities had these rows of crucifixions to terrorize people that they had to stay in line. The Jewish form of execution was stoning. So this was particularly a Roman and often a political form of execution. And we see the handing over from the Jewish religious authorities to the Roman authorities so that it's clear who will take responsibility for the death of Jesus. And so we're all kind of, and the best and the worst of our humanity is actually in this story. One of the techniques of the writers of the gospel, sometimes it's like Cecil B. DeMille, you pan back and you have the crowd scene. And then the camera will come in slowly and you'll have a face or a person. So as we read the story, to think about the characters that are going to be kind of revealed to us. And it's a kind of tapestry. And I want us to think about where we are. Who do we identify this year in this story? I wonder, we might feel like Peter, or we might feel like the women who stand by watching. When the men had deserted, the women are at least present and watch, and they feel powerless. Or we might feel that we're Joseph of Arimathea, and he is the wealthy, he's the guy from Millbrook, who's been hiding in the shadows, but somehow he finds the courage when Jesus is crucified to convince Pilate that he wants the body. And he probably buys the body, and he buys the linen cloth, and he buys the tomb, and he did his bit in the story. As the story is read this year, we're going to be removing the ornaments from the sanctuary. And it's a kind of stripping away. It's a kind of getting back to basics. And as we look at who we are, in all the pluses and minuses of who we are, there is a kind of stripping away. What are our ultimate values when push comes to shove? How will we make ethical, courageous decisions about who we are as people of faith? The other part of the story, in terms of looking at the crowd, is to think about how we deal with the crowd. And Jesus has a lot of experience of dealing with crowds. He's taught a lot, he's been in crowds, he's seen the worst and the best of crowds. Sometimes he has compassion on the crowd, but he never really buys into that kind of mass hysteria. And at the beginning of Lent, I talked about one of the greatest gifts we can do for each other is to be present, is just to be mindful of one another and be present. And this is exactly what Jesus does in the crowd. There are many stories where he's in a crowded situation and he will be aware of one person. The woman who comes to him and is so embarrassed by her illness that she can't even talk about it, but Jesus feels her touching his garments and he connects with her. And just before the Passion story in Luke's Gospel, the story of Zacchaeus. It's a wonderful story of this little guy who's too small to see what's going on, so he climbs up in a tree. And it is implied in the Gospels that Zacchaeus is involved in some kind of dealing with the government. He's kind of a collaborator. The crowd doesn't like Zacchaeus. And Jesus connects with him. He comes down, and Jesus says, I want to come and have dinner with you. And the crowd is furious because he's having dinner with a sinner. But the presence of Jesus in Zacchaeus' home and in his life transforms him. And he says, you know, I'm an honest person. If anybody says that I have defrauded them of anything, I will pay them fourfold. And that connection and that relationship transforms this person. So that is the kind of balancing that I think as we move into this week, that gives us a kind of keel to how do we deal with a lot of the pressure of the media, the public attention that's going on now? How do we make decisions about where we are? And I think this story can be really helpful. Jesus is no crowd pleaser. He doesn't want their praise, he wants their commitment. And they will make him pay for not giving what they want. A week is indeed a long time in politics, but the reactions and decisions of Jesus during this fateful week have eternal consequences. So in this final week of Lent, the church and each other listens and observes more attentively this epic drama we call life. And where are story.